evidently they're going to rejig this room in some ways. I'll just make an announcement, which I'll keep making, that next week on Thursday we'll have exam summary revision, course summary, past exam I'll go through. I'll put it up on my uni so you can get a taste for how the questions are asked and the structure of the exam. So that's there now. Next Thursday I want to actually go through that paper, and if you've got any questions, that's the time I can collectively answer how I expect some of those questions to be answered. And also that week 12, which is the next week on from that, no lectures and no tutorials. Okay, so I'll keep repeating it just so that everybody knows, but I will put a message up as well. So, right, migration and climate change, and obviously I want to look at some regional impacts, and you'll soon see why throughout the exam I'm asking you for examples of regions and countries, because most of what we do and say is really very specific sometimes, or particular to a particular country, levels of development, levels of income, etc. So clearly there's no one size fits all for most of the concepts nor the models. So in the answers you should really be saying, some of you might be more specific about Europe, for example, that's where you come from, so you might want to use Netherlands or Sweden as examples because that's what you know best. Other people, particularly in most of our courses, we actually concentrate Asia Pacific. I've tried to give a bit of a wider dimension, or Africa. So clearly if you come from the Northern Hemisphere, you might be more likely to give those examples, and that's fine by me, wherever you want those examples to come from. But you must provide examples, because things are region and country specific and not generic generally. And if someone is telling you this is a generic migration theory or whatever everywhere, they're wrong. So country specific examples are really important for whatever you're talking about. This connection, like many of those other connections between climate change and migration, is not a simple deterministic one. And whilst we can put environment under climate change, we look at migration and environment, we'll soon see why climate change is this concept, if you like, quite an emotive concept that we keep now placing things under, but clearly some of it is more specifically environmental change. And environmental change, as like climate change, will not be the main determinant. Other more complex things exist. And mobility is also only one response, obviously, amongst several others in terms of adaptation, particularly to climate change. Environmental deterioration from climate change or any other source is more often a contributory factor or cause of migration than its sole or even dominant one, meaning socioeconomic circumstances, political circumstances clearly can't make a living, whatever. Climate change might exacerbate the problem, but clearly often is not the sole link. And people trying to make it as a deterministic factor for lots of things are missing the point if they're not really taking account of levels of socioeconomic development, level of resource management, governance, for example, how well situations are actually managed within countries. So mobility responses are varied, and displacement is only basically a last response. So being forced to move is a fairly dramatic outcome. Other things usually can be done. And we were talking yesterday also that clearly farmers, people everywhere are already adapting. And at some point the adaptation probably won't work any longer, or they're already moving to higher ground, or moving to different areas, or being resettled. The response, like the whole household or people within the households are going to move away, is basically a fairly dramatic one or significant one. If they're going to move to cities or other areas first, might be the first response, and from there a cross-border or an international movement must be the very, very last response often. Or it may only be available or affordable or likely to occur for some groups within those populations. Like who might have the most options to actually move across borders.
Wealthy, skilled migrants.
Sorry?
Wealthy, skilled migrants.
Yeah, well, not necessarily even wealthy, but better educated, better skills. They can sell themselves to another country. And, you know, let's not forget, it's not personal choice half the time. It's policies within countries that you want to go to will allow you to come in and settle permanently or temporary or get a job as well. So there's all those factors. So in the context of Australia, we've been seeing that we have independent points assessment, for example. So as long as you can actually meet those requirements, you've got a good chance to getting permanent settlement. If you want a temporary visa, 457, or even a student visa or another visa, there are requirements that you have to comply with. And most importantly, even on permanent migration, you have to have a sponsor or an employer that's actually going to take you on within that job. So it's selective and it's competitive. So clearly, personal choice just to escape climate change has a lot of other dimensions that you must look at. The Intergovernmental Department or Panel on Climate Change report, in the fourth report, was one of the first times it started looking at migration, climate change, and also was looking at health. And specifically, it was saying stresses such as increased drought, water shortage, and riverine, which means riverbank and coastal flooding, will affect many local and regional populations. So this is 2007, which is 9 years ago now, but it was some of the first reports that were really trying to link migration to environment, climate change, and that report in particular, its 8th chapter, was actually saying how that was going to affect health and security as well. This will lead, in some cases, to relocation within and between countries, exacerbating conflicts and imposing migration pressures. Exacerbating conflicts, those movements clearly of refugee groups, but people through environmental displacement will make differences to certain region and put extra pressure. Hello? On. Anyway. Hotspots. We talked about hotspots in HIV/AIDS when we look at mobility, but there's also this concept of climate change hotspots. And the red countries here, and it's really across a couple of dimensions, and you probably can't read it, so I'll read it for you. The yellow is high population growth rates and high declines in agricultural production. High population growth rates, low resilience to climate change is the orange, and that's predominantly, clearly, African continent. The red is, other words, experiencing all three variables in terms of their high stress or very high components. And when you have those striated areas, you have plus current water stress or scarcity. So again, poor old Africa, but also we have India, this Central Asia here, South Asia, very highly affected. Parts, obviously, South America, but not to the extent Africa. So we could say this through here, these regions clearly are, let's say, areas that are going to suffer the most. They also contain large numbers of population. So they've already got population pressure. Any changes in those dimensions clearly are going to exacerbate the problem. It's not saying the rest of the world doesn't experience anything. So it says basically the white is no data for one or more of those variables it's looking at. So it doesn't mean to say they all escape. It just means it's identifying Africa, South Asia, as a big potential, if you like, for the most important aspects which could drive migration. So areas of greatest risk, deltas. We talked briefly about these river deltas. Are generally heavily settled fertile areas, outlets of great rivers to the sea, especially in China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand and Bangladesh. So as river deltas, why are they settled in the first place? Why are they settled in the first place?
Because of water.
Source of water
Agriculture.
and very fertile land. So agricultural production high and predominantly can support big populations. The fact that a very high intensity of population causes extra pressure. They've always flooded these areas, but clearly any rise in sea level or intrusion of salt water to those areas is going to become more problematic as time goes by. This population has also increased in those deltas, and many of them also have large cities or more urban populations. Small reef islands, which we're probably most familiar with, and especially atolls, which we're talking about, not only in the Pacific but elsewhere as well, but unfortunately, as I said before, we concentrate a lot on Asia Pacific because that's the region that we're actually within. Low rainfall areas, exacerbated water stress situations. So if you've got, let's say, variable rainfall, low variable rainfall, you're highly at risk. Other problems with areas is they rely on the monsoons. If the monsoon weather is late, you can have major problems, particularly for crops like rice and other crops that they rely on. When I was in Vietnam a few years ago, they were really waiting on the monsoon, and they were getting very worried, not only by their current water supplies they had, but clearly they couldn't get their rice crops in on time if those monsoon rains didn't come soon. Major river valleys and associated floodplains all will be very susceptible to flooding or any changes in terms of water flow. Low-lying coastal plains are also very highly at risk, particularly for storms, water surges, tide surges, and clearly those lying low in coastal areas are increasingly, the water supply has been polluted or through increasing salinisation, and also the land for crops, etc., is becoming less productive. We generally have coastal megacities. Very rarely do we have a city that's not on a major river or on the coast. And therefore, the major climate change hazards, particularly for Asia-Pacific regions, have been identified as some of the global regions most at risk of experiencing natural disasters. And I can't stress enough, some of the high risk is because they also have very large population numbers, and they've been growing the most rapidly, as well as experiencing a lot of migration to them as well. So clearly there's a double whammy here in terms of the populations were very high anyway, And I was reading somewhere the other day that you've got 30 to 40% increases in these populations through a lot of rural urban migration into them, plus migrants and others wanting to go to the major cities. So strong correlations between countries most at risk of experiencing these hazards and those great at risk from giant climate change. So you could say, well, that's not very surprising, is it? So we have this double effect of where the most pressure is, of population in particular. We also have the most climatic risk, but they're also generally the most favourable locations that people want to go to and settle in as well. So again, coasts, inundations, storm surges, deltas, coastal plains, cyclones, typhoons, a riparian flooding, impact of glacier melt and water stressed those atolls, low-lying islands and the mega cities. So you might say, well, okay, that includes a lot of areas, and again, they all share in common the biggest populations basically in the world. This is vulnerability to adverse effects in Southeast Asia region. Obviously anything looking red shades down to yellow. This is right through Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. Obviously highly vulnerable areas that have been worked out, again on the grounds of variables such as population pressure, rainfall, variability, climate variability and others. So that climate change variability is going to really hit most areas of Southeast Asia and very hard in terms of the Philippines and also parts of Java, but up through Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam too. This is the Mekong coming through here. Mekong, very the lifeline to most of those countries for populations. Again, the huge delta of the Mekong is also problematic in terms of just how many people it supports and how many, and that's their livelihoods as well, not just drinking water we're talking about. So okay, most of the issues regarding climate change, there's enormous uncertainty about the extent or scale of climate change, its severity and the timing of these climate change impacts. Again, this is a big unknown. I know some scientists say we have very good estimates, we have very good figures. Unfortunately, I don't think if they did, and they don't have, if they did, they'd be making lots of money at the moment, because clearly there's a lot of debate about when and where and the severity of some of these changes. The other thing that's just not well understood is how it does relate to migration. At what point in this timing of climate change are people forced to migrate, or they choose to migrate? Or are they all forced, or is there a certain amount of choice that you can adjust or adapt? But migration as an adaptation mechanism might be members of the household go and earn money or go elsewhere, or it may be the whole household actually moving elsewhere. And they might also move in stages. What I'm saying is we know little about those processes, and we need to know some more, I think. There's also a lack of institutions or structures in place to cope or to adapt, meaning a lot of governments recognise the problem, but clearly to try to address the problem, you need resources, you need experience, you need to be able to convince your populations that these things are going to happen, and that sometimes also is impossible. The time available to make preparations is there, but we don't know how long those preparations are going to be and how severe or otherwise that we're planning for. So all those unknowns make it an area where there's quite a lot of debate, consideration, and guess what? Denial. Right, let's just deny this is going to happen. A lot of those Asian countries, Bangladesh and others, that I've had some students working in coastal areas and how people perceive and whether they have migrated, people in families have migrated elsewhere. They say a lot of that's just the act of God changing temperature or changing weather. They don't believe really that there's any different than what's happened in the past, except they're being forced to adapt along the way or move to higher ground as they go. They're doing all those things, but they're not recognising it necessarily as climate change. In a study of the entire Asia-Pacific region, it is possible only to look at vulnerability at a very macro national level, although it needs to be recognised there are important micro variations. And that's currently what a lot of research is focusing on, is going down to particular case studies of villages or areas to try to get a better understanding, rather than all this prediction at a country or national level, at a macro level or a global level, is not meaning very much for certain communities where the vulnerability is different, or how they're going to adjust to it happens to be very different as well. So we've actually got a handful or more of postgrad studies over the last few years looking at particular areas, particular case studies. Urban slums in Ankara, for example, coastal communities in Bangladesh, other areas in Ghana, farming areas. So it's coming down to trying to get a better understanding right down the grassroots level. That's just briefly for South Asia, and this is where you have double whammy effects. This is clearly Bangladesh, Bay of Bengal. You've got not only water stress, river flooding, but also cyclones and typhoons are much more prone along the coasts, and coastal flooding. So it can be multiple sources of risk or calamities that can affect certain areas. So that is pretty widespread. Coastal areas are likely to get the double whammy, and other areas with the most populations are actually settling. So coast countries most vulnerable. This study was done in 2010 by a risk analysis firm, produced a climate change vulnerability index for 42 separate social, economic and environmental indicators. Again, they're looking at social as well as environmental, and what we find is 16 countries at being at extreme risk, including 10 in Asia, and clearly Bangladesh, India, Madagascar, Nepal, Mozambique, Philippines, Haiti, Afghanistan. Our African ones, Zimbabwe, we've got Myanmar, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Thailand, Malawi, Pakistan. So all generally, what do they have in common? What could we say most of them have in common?
Living near water.
Sorry?
Like near water.
Yeah, but what else do they have in common?
Oh, high population.
Yeah.
Still developing.
Sorry?
Still developing.
Still developing, generally low income, huge populations, limited basic resources, and some of them, I guess we could answer governance is not all that strong in terms of trying to manage any environmental risks as well. Forecasted population at risk from sea level rise in 2050. Top 10 countries. I don't think we really like being in these top 10 countries globally. India. These are the in millions population at risk, mainly coastal areas. 37 million. Bangladesh, 27 million. China, 22 million. Indonesia, Philippines, Nigeria, Vietnam, Japan, United States and Egypt. Other Asian countries in the top 20, Korea, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Thailand. All of them share fairly big populations and share a coastal, or they've got island communities, which are clearly most at risk. So nations with the highest numbers of their urban population within the low elevation coastal zone, so that's zones that are really very low coastal zone areas, so they're subject, if you like, to sea level rise. Along the coast that is less than 10 metres above sea level. So in other words, if there's any major changes in sea level rise, they're most subject to tidal surges, cyclones, typhoons, etc. And these are the urban population. 80 million almost in China, India. China stands out. India, Japan, a series of island communities, or big island communities, but nevertheless, same with Indonesia. 13,000 islands through Indonesia, all with nice coastal zones subject to risk. Again, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand. Oh, Netherlands comes in there. I wonder why. Again, this low coastal elevation and being measured that clearly if we have any degree of sea level rise, they'll be most at risk. There's also dry regions. Between 10 and 20% are already degraded, very dry regions with highly variable rainfall generally. And there is increasing pressure on dry land ecosystems. So if you're in one of these low-lying ecosystem water areas, higher ground usually means dry areas anyway, so these are at risk and have been for some time, or they're very marginal lands, that's why they haven't been settled or not settled to the same extent. So climate change is increasing water scarcity, which is already in those areas, already under water stress, because the zone has only 8% of global renewable fresh water resources, but it has basically a third of the global population. This is matched with clearly where the big population sizes are and the areas most at risk. Droughts are generally becoming more frequent, placing great stress on the community's coping mechanisms. So in other words, they're coping and they've coped for some time, but the message is maybe that won't be able to continue, particularly if we have settlement of movement of people out of those high-risk coastal areas into some of these regions. That's where migration itself causes further environmental stress and degradation. So, ability to cope with climate change impacts will depend on obviously poverty and income, and most of those countries that we've really been highlighting there are low-income countries whereby you have really high proportions of the population living in poverty anyway. Inappropriate policies and institutions, and basically weak governance, and that's what I said before. One of the really important elements is, in many developing countries, low-income countries, is, let's say, how good is the governance, how good is the political structure, how good is the intent of government to actually overcome these problems. Or just the resources probably aren't there either, or nor the knowledge sometimes of how best to adapt or cope. Resilience, strength in adapting to or overcoming vulnerability. Resilience is really important. Many communities will tell you we're resilient, we're coping somehow anyway. And this question of length of time we've got to be able to cope, either whether we're planning for the future or we're trying to cope at present. And it's like everything, you feel if it's short term, you can get by. If it's going to be a long-term change, And a lot of these societies think, oh well, yes, the rainfall of that this season, it will be best next season. They don't see it as a long-term prospect. And maybe it's not. Maybe it is still such a fluctuating phenomenon. So in attempting to qualitatively assess potential impacts, and we're really interested on future migration, those hotspots areas are likely to experience more severe impacts of climate change, and that's why it's useful to try to establish vulnerability areas of coast. I had a student a few years ago now, he did vulnerability to coastal change in particular in South Australia, relatively small communities living around coastal areas. And the argument was, it's all right, we'll cope, there isn't any impact, there isn't. So I don't know if it's denial or perhaps being positive and clearly a resilience there as well. Sea level rise, storm surges, hurricanes, riparian flooding, again riverbank flooding, reduced rainfall in all those areas. However, it's not just the physical environment. You need to really look at the vulnerability through the incidence of poverty, proportion of your household's livelihood based on agriculture or production, and also that national governance question. So they're just as important as trying to just, let's say, focus on sea level rise or incidents of extreme weather. You really need to put that with the circumstances in which that's occurring. Is extent of migration and migration-related networks. Why are networks, I always try to stress networks, why are networks important? Networks.
Like between countries? Or
Well, they can be between countries. Networks between migrants, I'm really talking about. So if you're planning a move,
oh, because you will have someone to rely on. Like once you arrive, they can help you get
and
on.
they can give you information about where you're going. They, for example, in Australia, they could actually get you an employer. So those migration networks are important. They're usually, in some contexts, already existing because they have family members that have migrated to another country. That's where you get a flow-on effect. And maybe it's much more easily done from countries with those networks. So all those things I'm saying is really important in trying to assess the viability of migration as being a coping response. Large cities in Asia, most vulnerable to sea level rise impacts according to their height above sea levels. And I'm just talking about Asia here, sorry, Europe, another matter. But here, obviously, Bangkok, Dhaka, Bangladesh, Shanghai, Tianjin, it's in Tokyo, whole Osaka Kobe district within Japan, Canton on the Pearl River Delta, Karachi, Pakistan, Jakarta, Indonesia, Taipei, Kolkata, Bombay, Manila, Philippines, Niagara, Japan, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. And clearly there's a variability of metres above sea levels here, but populations are general, these are in millions by the way, are generally again characterised by large populations in the millions. So if there's any talk about resettlement, you're not talking about thousands, you're talking about, you're into the millions, so very big populations. Response to environmental change at the community level. Obviously you have environmental stress, and that could be mediated by social, political, economic and cultural factors. That's where your vulnerability, resilience divide comes. We have passive acceptance, many will get by. We live here anyway, somehow or other. All will be well. We have active in situ adaptation or adjustment, building seawalls or riverbank levees or barrages or whatever for long-term survival. And this last box obviously is migration, displacement, that's often the last resort. Circular, meaning they might for times of the year move to other areas and move back to the area or within the country. And it might be the whole community or part of a community. So there's lots of options there in terms of what's happening in some contexts. Unfortunately, it's quite selective in terms of who amongst those groups has the ability to move or adjust anyway. It's not just individuals, it's whole communities and how they're actually governments or the government actually perceives problems in areas. So those migration policy responses, most response will obviously be in situ, in place. So, they'll somehow or other adapt depending on resources, what can be done, build more seawalls or levees, or obviously according to the problem, what is the problem. And again, must also realise some groups will not be able to adapt at all, meaning it's outside their resource field or knowledge field or ability to do so. Affordability comes into that. Overwhelmingly internal migration is involved, but also some might be across borders. Migration, and again, those cross-border migrations may be with families that have connections outside their current situation or have migrant members in countries overseas anyway. So that's why networks become quite important in that adaptation process. And migration responses clearly are those two types. Adapt somehow where you live or the country you live in, or displacement is much more dramatic in terms of going to different areas within the country or going elsewhere overseas. So we see migration as an adaptation response, and it's been a coping mechanism generally brought about through droughts or disasters or whatever. How permanent that is the question really. Do they go back to areas after those crisis periods, or they've made a complete adjustment to do different patterns of settlement within countries and also outside countries? Several forms. Sending of family members to other locations, and that can be for work, and again setting up networks they might follow later. Or it might just be to send enough income home if your livelihood is affected by slowdown in agriculture production or can't produce your rice crop or whatever. Temporary displacement, particularly associated with acute disasters, like in Aceh after Indonesian tsunami, for example. Circular migration, commuting might be one way to adapt to whatever the problems are within particular locations. Calling in remittance obligations which remain dormant in normal times, so some disaster struck, climate change, you have migrants working abroad or wherever, you might be making more demands on their money or their income that they're actually earning. And also generally more options available to those better off sections of the community, especially as a proactive early response. So again, it's the income differentials, education differentials, usually young, which are more likely to be able to cope than our older sections, older persons in communities. So migration is displacement, as I said, last resort. Often involves the poorest because they have no access to adaptation options. So as distinct from migration being an adaptation option, you're forced off the land or you're forced to go to other areas. Much experience of forced displacement in Asia. Land resettlement transmigration in Indonesia for many years, this is going back to the 80s and 90s, 2000, been trying to resettle people out of crowded Asia, Java, in Indonesia, to the outer islands, which they perceived needed and could sustain populations. Unfortunately, most of the farming practices really in the volcanic lush soils of Java were not the same. If you went to Borneo or other outer islands, just didn't have the same, you couldn't actually grow the crops the same way, or they weren't so intensively being able to be settled. So that was lots of disasters there, but there was attempts by government a long time ago to actually distribute population. Resettlement schemes, particularly of agricultural workers, are generally not that successful. They can be disastrous. Sorry.
When do they ask the group of people to move over? Like, do they give them a money incentive, or is it?
Yes.
So it's not forced.
Land incentives,
Okay.
but the outcome generally was
It's not that great.
not that.
Do they have the option to move back to where they came from?
I don't know about that. I think there are problems with that, because one of the big problems in those cases of resettlement, okay, the young or most adventurous or taking your incentives are likely to go and leave family behind, say in Java, a village somewhere. Ultimately, they'd want to go back to joint family because they become isolated. They find they can't actually, we did some work out in the outer islands in Indonesia, late 80s, 90s, and they also just couldn't produce the same crops and actually weren't making a good living out of what they were doing anyway. They were unhappy. They even had housing built for them in some contexts, but like it all might have sounded grand in the beginning, but
Was it too overcrowded in like the mainland that
In
they
Java.
wanted to move people?
Java, very overcrowded comparatively to the outer islands.
Okay.
And I guess defence-wise and otherwise, they saw it as a good idea to settle more to the outer islands. But Java still has very much the bulk of the population. Disaster, temporary and permanent displacement. Generally, displacement schemes have not worked, is what I'm saying. And mega projects like the 3 dams, gorges in China. Again, it's a major disruption, social disruption, cultural disruption, economic disruption, and so people generally aren't happy about being displaced. And I think the older groups that have lived there all their lives are very much more unsettled maybe than the younger groups. But any resettlement scheme has its price, if you like, in terms of being negative. Atolls and low-lying islands, there's major issues involved. They haven't resolved some of that. Do they relocate to Australia? I currently have a student who is from Tonga, who is a PhD student, looking at prospects of worker schemes in Australia. There seems to be a lot of negativity about them at that stage, and training and skills and whatever. So yes, it's very complex issues trying to actually get people reconnected to somewhere else. Key issues: how to effectively portray climate change in present contexts. Presently, when you're talking to a lot of communities about climate change that might happen 25, 50 years in advance, it's actually difficult for most of us, I think, to really conceive what they're talking about. Maybe better to gauge climatic variability and its impact. So instead of saying climate change, really concentrate currently on climate variability and what that may mean. We found usually they'll talk about temperature change or rainfall change in the context of the last few years, but not things about, 25 years in the future, 100 years or whatever. It's quite beyond a lot of people's comparability. Another PhD student that did climate change in dry region of Western China. And one of the examiners came back and demanded she not talk about climate change, she talk about climate variability. We ended up changing the actual title as well to variability because I thought he had a valid comment about the thesis, and I thought basically from her findings it made more sense to say it was about climate variability. So maybe we just have to change the wording of what we're saying. Concept's still the same, but maybe...
Does climate change seem more as like a negative term?
Yeah. And I think that's because the way it's been promoted.
Yeah.
But that's another thing, the whole media promotion. And it is a motive term, that's why I said starting out, and people like to grab hold of thesis on climate change. Sounds really good. And then when you really look at the content and what she found, in that case, let's call it climate variability and keep our examiner happy as well. Needs to be considered in the context of existing migration, not separately. So where the patterns of migration are now, that's where, if there is an adaptation, that's where the pressure is going to end up being in the future as well. We can influence migration through impact both at origin and destination, and that should also be the linkages still be in place because we need to look at those migration networks. So whatever the patterns are now or established is likely to be what patterns will be in the longer term, just simply because you've got the networks and they're already established, you have the knowledge, you have the people there that might be able to assist you to go and settle in that area and find you a job or...
Would that be like a
housing.
certain, like a place from a specific region always going to a specific place due to the previous pattern?
Yeah, it's more likely to be, there's already patterns there, knowledge built up. It's like a lot of your migration we're looking at globally was set up through colonial periods. If you want to go back that back in time, that's where the linkages are still existing because you have relatives or you have knowledge or you get taught the history at school or the knowledge of those areas. So those migration networks and existing patterns are useful to try to determine what maybe the future will look like or the future exodus where it might go. And interrelationship with poverty, the poorest sections are least able to use migration, so adaptation, and are more likely to be forcibly displaced. And that might be due to government projects or government like Indonesia and other places saying we need to get people out of these areas. We're going to make resettlement issues like China's already done, Thailand's done, Vietnam's done as well, for areas that clearly they want a dam or they want to take away from monsoon flooding or whatever. Barriers to establishing a new international regime to protect climate change migrants, difficulty in separating climate change from those other drivers of migration. Is it climate change or is it socioeconomic change or is it environmental degradation or is it seawater intrusion, salinity? No, what are the factors? And it's easy to say climate change, but it's probably not really providing any understanding. Reluctance of potential destination countries to accept a new country of asylum seeker. These are your environmental displaced persons. Australia is reluctant to take all our Pacific Islanders off those atolls and place them in the context of Australia, for example. Lack of existing international cooperation on migration throughout Asia and Pacific. Generally, countries will say we have our own problems and we're not willing to take those sort of migrants. And I guess we should look more at the short-term versus the long-term goals. That's where I'm saying we might get more, what do you say, acceptance or belief if we're concentrating more on the short term than these long-term goals out, 50, 100 years. You get people saying, well, I probably won't be here then, so, I want a short-term goal. I'll just stick them, but it's coastal and river areas, China, it's long-term planning, short-term. Main factors, there's been in most of Asia, Western Asia, South Asia, consistent temperature increases, reduction in rainfall in many areas. There's been increased frequency of extreme events, and there is melting of mountain glaciers. And that's why I'm saying if we concentrated a bit more on what's going on in terms of variability, there might be a better understanding or acceptance. An increasing water shortage problem in all those areas. Already environmental migration being initiated by government in selected areas in China to overcome water shortages in desert areas. And that's what Ling was looking at in her PhD. Western China, very dry, populations being basically encouraged to go elsewhere. Indonesia. Pacific, more complex, atoll and island, most at risk, and it's only some of them more so than others. For most countries, a relocation will be internal if land for new settlement can be made available. As I said, any resettlement, even with countries, not within countries, is not straightforward. Some areas become wetter, some will become drier, and opportunities do exist of redistribution between islands, which often means countries. However, agricultural practices might differ, like Indonesia, which didn't basically work. Urban pressures and, as I said, migrations to Australia and US from some of those groups as well. Basically, climate change will add to push factors that contribute to the decision to move long before conditions become so intolerable that mass relocation of people on a permanent basis is required. And I think that's true. We've got to recognise what is the current situation, who is tolerating or resilient to what sorts of conditions. Okay, I'll get to conclusion, but they're in the slides. There is a need to put in place a framework for recognition, and going back to Tuesday's lecture, of environmental migrants as in a separate convention or part of an intergovernmental treaties on environment. So this is where it needs to be recognised. If migration is an adaptation process to climate change, ultimately we can expect many more of these groups of people. Recommend that the 1951 Convention on Refugees not be extended, as I said the other day. There is a need to empower the relevant entities of the UN and other organisations like the Migration Organisation to provide assistance to environmental migrants, classify them some way and actually be there to help or assist in countries, cope with them, support for adaptive policies in countries least able to afford them, and the regional and country-specific studies important for greater understanding of the likely impacts. And that's why I'm saying smaller, more micro studies of particular countries and within countries would greatly help or how you're going to approach this problem. Okay. Sorry, I had a